Good morning. Ayin Beis, Volume 3. We're on page 1356. What we learned yesterday was in the context of Makabel and Mashpia, as he identified earlier, the sun being the ultimate Mashpia, because it was created in a way that is bright, but also generates light and illuminates darkness. And there's the Makabel, and there are three levels in the Makabel: the moonlight, the light of a bright stone, and the light of vision. And he explained the differences between them. So he said, that's all a dugma calls to understand Zoh and Malchus. Zoh is the quintessential mashpia, the etza mahuse, and Malchus is the quintessential makabel, the etza mahusa, in its core nature, its core personality, as we explained. Now, what is the difference between mashpia and makabel? Being that we're talking now not necessarily due to any fault. You could say that due to the miyut halavana, the diminishment of the moon, so that caused the lavana to become a makabel. And before that, the moon would have also been a mashpia. Tu ma'eres agdel. He says, no, that's not the case. They were created as mashpia and makabel. Zoh and Malchus were initially created that way. That the one would be a mashpia, one would be a makabel. They're both oir, but they function differently. So what's the difference? So the first difference he explained yesterday, we learned that, is the difference between Gili and Helam. That a mashpia is, in the language that he said here, like this: Hu b'chinas Gili v'amakabel, hu b'chinas Helam. It's like a oir and a keli. The oir is essentially, what is the role of oir? Is to give off light, is to illuminate. Illumination, by definition, is a form of hashpah, is a flow. The role of a keli is to contain, is to absorb. And so the role of a makabel is to conceal. What is conceal here? We don't mean necessarily only concealment as in the worst possible concealments that we've learned about, but it's a concealer in the sense its role is not a flow of revelation. It's the regulator that filters, that limits, that diminishes, that conceals, and allows the flow to be properly channeled, as we shall learn. But right now, the word is helam. He gave the example from the shaman, and in that case, oir, even when it comes down to the lowest level, always retains, that's his personality. It's gili, even if it's a small light, but its role is light. Keli, even the highest level, the most subtle level, its role is helam. And he gave the example in the parentheses at the bottom of 1355 and top of 1356. The example was from neshamas. That what? That neshamas, even the greatest, the highest neshamas, the lowest neshamas that go down even to the level of the akev, which is the heel, what he called gasas haruach, that they don't have appreciation for the subtlety. Gas haruach is a coarse spirit or a callous spirit. Nevertheless, it's a divine soul. It's capable of reaching an aveda, a very high level. And he cited from the Kutetera what I was just quoting now, that even Bnei Yaakov is still atzmis nefesh. Due to atzmis nefesh, is capable of feeling madrega tachten harim komo kanefesh lekis v'hoyse betela be'erein sof mamish, and it has that is betela, which has had that sublimation like a ner b'fnei avukas shazel bitl elyon ma'od. So that's even the lowest level. That's like oir. Even as it comes down below, it still retains that divine aspect in the neshama. In the case of light. On the other hand, it's the helam of neshamas, meaning how the neshamas come down in a state of concealment. Even the greatest souls, meaning the highest level, now we're talking about kelim, helam, also are not the way it is, the way the neshama is above. Like he quotes from Tanya chapter 37, that even tzaddikim gemurim, a tzaddik gamur who serves God with reverence, and avad rabba b'tainugim, he cannot reach the dveikas that he had as it was above before he came down to this world. hachumri, to this coarse world, okay. And the same is when the neshama comes down to Bria, it's not like the neshama as it would have been in Atzilus. So all that's an example, both for Eris and Kalim, how the Eris, even as they come down below, they're still emanators, luminaries of light. They're still carriers of light. And the Kalim, even in the highest subtle levels, still are a state of concealment. It's Kamoy Kain, B'chinas Mashpia is Gilui in all the levels. That's a Mashpia. It's fundamentally a state of Gilui on all levels. And the fact that there's a Tzimtzum, he says, is due to a Dovish Chutz B'menu. It's not the Oir itself, it's due to another factor outside of it that is causing it to be concealed or limited. The be'etzem ubchinas gili, because oyer is gili. Another force, it's like the gas and the brakes. The brakes can slow down the car, but the brakes are not made out of the gas. It's a different entity. So in this case, the oyer itself is gili, and at simsum, a dovish achus b'menu can cause it to be concealed. And that's why b'chol simsumim, it's still in a state of gili. The makabel is the other way around. It's helam. It's etzem muhuseh. Rak mashu keli lekabel. Its only role is to receive. Its role is not to give. Its role is to receive. And the oir and gili in it, that's like a dover nesef. That's like an additional element on etzem muhuseh. So the real etzem muhuseh of a keli, what did it come to contribute? Recipient, to receive. Like many times I've explained with Chazara when we listen to the Rebbe. So when you're in the mode of listening, you're not in the mode of giving. You're not exuding. In the language of the Gemara, I did the Torah lemivla lepolit. When you're busy absorbing, you can't be exuding, giving off. So your whole role then is to just receive. That's what he calls helam, which means it's not about giving off light, it's about receiving light. So even though it does have the element, like he says, there's Eiran Gili in it, because it's not like complete concealment. The person absorbing is hearing and listening to it, but nevertheless, it's a dover neshef al etzem muhuseh, because the real position you're in then is an absorption. Or the other way around, that even when it's going through a tzimtzum, the main point of it is Gili. And there's another force that causes it to be concealed or diminished or in some way limited. Okay. And that's where we stopped. And being that the keli, his role is absorption and receiving, therefore it conceals on the light because it's containing it. That's its role. Its role is not to be speaking at that point. We're not talking about afterwards. Afterwards, the keli could be mamshich downward, and we'll learn about that. We're talking right now when they stand with each other. Eir and keli. Eir is shining, keli is receiving. So they're very two different positions. One is going like coming, it doesn't say mamayla lamata or mamata lamayla, but one is essentially a flow, a gilui, and the other is in a state of reception, transmission and reception. That's what he says so far. So now we'll continue the parentheses. So the next section is the parentheses in the middle of page 1356. The line begins v'hagilui. Yeah. I'll add one more thing. What I said yesterday, that was after we stopped the recording, was that even though in volume 2, he did explain at length that the ultimate goal is to bring together Eir and Keli. The ultimate goal is that the Tzimtzum itself should be transformed to Eir. That's the goal. That ultimately, after each one does their role, the goal is going to be that they join together and they both express the Havaya Hu Elikim and godliness. But he also explained that within the Eir is embedded the kavanah, the intention that it should ultimately come through a tzimtzum to be received by the recipients. And within the tzimtzum is embedded the kavanah, the intention that it should be ultimately causing a gili. Tzimtzum b'shvil hagili, we learned. But that does not contradict what we're saying here. Because here he's talking about their actual function, just like the function of Avaya, the function of Elikim. There's the function of Gili and there's the function of Tzimtzum. That's in the functionality of it. Once creation happens through a combination of and Keli, Gili and Helam, once the teacher has transmitted properly, then comes another thing called Avodah, the growth that we go through, the maturity, the development, where the Keli begins to absorb more Remember, we learned the 3 levels of Ratzeh, and the receives from higher levels. But like he said in the previous page with the Lias Malchus, that's already Avodah. That's how Malchus is beginning to elevate to come closer to Zoh, to the Mashpia, to Zoh, and even higher and higher. So it shouldn't be. It's 2 separate discussions. Right now, we're talking about the very ingredients that God uses to create. In the process, there's Gili, Oyed, and Keli. And that's what we're addressing right now. Mashpia Makabel, the way it was established. Then, of course, the goal is that the Makabel should continue to receive more and more from his Mashpia to the point where they can join and they can even go higher levels, even to the point of Helam Ha'atzmi. So just not to confuse the two, the key thing to remember is that. So, and they're both created by God. So obviously the Oyer understands that it needs to go into the Keli, and the Keli knows it has to receive Oyer, and they're not mutually exclusive functions. But in the specific details, when you're building the building, a brick is not an electric wire. Even though together they will join and build a beautiful mansion, but at the point of building, you can't have a confusion. You need the boundaries. You need the structure. You need to know what is Chachma, what is Bina, what is Das, what is what is Keli. So that's what we're addressing right now, is the very nature of Mashpia Makabel. Before we talk about the Avodah of it, which will be discussed, was discussed and will be discussed. So now, in the parentheses, the Rebbe Rashab continues to qualify and say, somebody's going to touch upon a little what I just said, but from a different angle a bit. So he says like this now. So going back to the line, your pages are at ayinbeis.com if you want to follow the text. So he says like this. The Gam Lefia Mitis Ha'inyan. Also, when you consider the whole purpose of all of this, Amitis Ha'inyan means here, not that he's, God forbid, that says something that was emes. Amitis Ha'inyan, what the Keli really, the ultimate purpose of all of this is. It's not just the Keli should be Helam and the Ur should be Gili. She says, Gam Lefi Amitis Ha'inyan, the B'chinas Keli leKabbalah, hu dafke B'chinas Habitl v'heder HaMetzia shel HaKeli. Because based on what we just learned, you could just simply say, all a Keli is just this inanimate or passive, I don't say passive, this passive entity whose role is to conceal, to receive, and the process to conceal. The truth is, the fact that the Keli is a Keli the Kabbalah is not stamazeh. It's coming, it's not just like that, it's coming. Hudavke b'chinas habitl v'heder matziyah shel HaKeli is due to the tremendous bitl. So it doesn't say tremendous. Is due to the sublimation, due to the nullification, due to its sense of egolessness. The heder matziyah shel HaKeli. That's why it's a Keli Kabbalah. The Keli is a state of bitl to receive the oyer. U'kamishon is bar le'il dibra maschel al gimel dvarim. Like we learned in volume 2, al gimel dvarim, down below they cite page 1012. Ushem ali dezem kabela sa'er b'yeser. And due to this bittul, that's what allows the Keli to receive even more in other words, the Keli is not an enemy of the it's the opposite. The Keli is completely like a student that's completely bottled to his teacher and is absorbing everything. And the more the bittul, the greater the Ukamashon is bar le'il ba'erech, as was explained earlier, be'inya rotzeh v'shuv. As I just pointed out, rotzeh v'shuv, what was rotzeh v'shuv? Rotzeh is reaching upward, shuv is integrating, that the Keli becomes more bottled, more rotzeh to the oyer, and therefore it draws down more oyer. The same thing, the oyer keeps on going upward. So it's a process, is actually when you speak that language, you don't even hear the word helam. You hear on the opposite, you hear bittul of the keli to the oir, and that's causing the oir to be drawn down, and to be greater oir should be received. So in a way, it's not a question really, it's a qualification in the context like I just explained. He's going to say the difference is that that's true. He's not negating that. That's a mitzvah, that's really the role of a keli. However, u'makom mokim hadizebchinas keli shemalemes. However, even with that, taking that into account, the whole kavanah and the way the keli functions and all of that, bottom line is the role, the personality of the keli is shemalemes ala'ir, is that it conceals the light. Yes, it's absorbing it, and the more bittul, the more it can absorb. But the actual functionality of the keli is a concealer, not a revealer. Because if the light just shined without limitations, there was no keli, as we'll learn, there'd be no makablim altogether. It would be like a teacher just teaching, like someone just afloat without any filters, without any channeling. So bottom line is this: malemes ala'ir hein be'etzem tfisasa ha'ir. And in two ways, he says, both in the very way the keli captures and grasps the oir, she'einu k'maishu be'etzem. So what do we see when a keli is receiving from the oir? It's not the oir as it is in its purest form. The keli is receiving because the oir is being tailored to fit the keli. If a teacher completely is oblivious and ignores the student and just teaches, that's not a keli. A keli means that the keli is diluting in some way the oir. So even though the advantage is that it's being integrated and internalized, and the more bittul, the more it can receive, but in practicality, the keli's role is one of helam, that is concealing the oir, hein, both in the way it grasps the oir, that it's not the same as the oir is in its etzem on its own. So when we're receiving, the oir has now come into a level of going through a concealment, and vehein bashpos er shayidei keli, and also how the oir is transmitted from the keli further downward. So that too is in a state is through a helam. U'kamishn is barley, as was explained earlier. Let's use a simple example. If I'm taking a big barrel of wine or a big goblet of wine and pouring people little cups of wine. Now here it's not a qualitative shift, but it's still quantitative. Let's say, right? So you're taking from from a hashpah and you're putting it into keli. The keli is going to have a lot less wine than the way it was coming from its source. And then when you drink from it, or you take the cup and pour it to somebody else, that too is a helam. So it's a helam in both how the keli receives and how the keli transmits to the next level what it received. That's what he's saying. Or to use another example, when you take a very intense idea or emotion and feeling, and you're going to communicate it in words. So the words are kelim. The kelim, by definition, are going to limit the flow. There's no way. Liba lepuma legalia, it says. A person in their lips cannot express the full intensity of what's going on in their hearts. That's why we say often, I can't fully articulate it. I don't have the words for it. So the words are a helam. They're an expression, but they're a helam over the very core oir, the words on the page, the words of speech, and the way they also transmit the idea to another person. So both the very fact that the kelim receive the oir is in a diminished and concealed way, and also how they communicate through the words. When you read the page or you hear the words, the listener is also, it's also a helam. So the helam is both in how the keli grasps and contains the energy, and how it transmits that energy to those that the kelim transmits to. So what he qualified in this parenthesis, that this does not negate, he's clearly acknowledging that keli has a tremendous role in bittul and receiving oir. Here we're talking about, as I said earlier, the pure functionality of keli and oir. And we're also not talking about the growth that a person matures and grows, obviously the kalim expand and they'll be able to receive more oir and more oir, and that is the process of the development. Here we're talking about the pure structure, the creation of existence of Mashpia Mekabel, Zah, Malchus, sun and moon. That's what he qualified in the parentheses. Okay. Any questions before I continue? I'll try to stop at each section so we can clarify if any clarification is needed.
It's not the same thing. He said that the Keli hein be'etzem tfisoso be'oil, she'enu k'moshu be'etzem, ve'hen b'ashpoas oil shal yedei Keli. Because
what I just explained was not sufficient. I gave an example. There's the receiving of the oil, and there's the Keli pouring it to someone else. The letters on the page, as they convey, the author has to conceal the idea to some extent to put it into words, and the one who's reading the book has to then is getting it in a concealed way.
Hobohotalia, no?
Hobotalia is not a problem, but it's two things. Hein ve'hein. Explaining how the Keli is a state of Helen, yeah. It is Hobotalia, that's fine. Okay. So now the Rebbe Rashab is going to go back to Zah and Malchus and sum up. So what do we know from all of this? What's the point of all of this? Still didn't come back to the punchline. Just explained the difference between Mashpia and Mekabel. How does that play itself out in Zah and Malchus? So he says like this now. And therefore, based on this, the Mashpia is fundamentally Gilui. Mekabel is fundamentally Helam. On all levels, like he explained. That's why from the level of Zah, im hayes, shezel madrega achrena shebe'ed ein sof, v'nikra sefer elam ein sof. Even though I'll explain what that means in a moment. Let me just translate it and then we'll explain. It's considered the lowest level of Eid Ein Sof. And it's called Sefer Elam Ein Sof, the end of the infinite world. So even though it's the lowest level of the highest, but since it's in the gather of Mashpia and Oyer, as we said, even the lowest level of Oyer is still a Gili, and that Gili is too intense to allow the existence of the worlds. They savas sametzias who mebchinas ha-malchus dafka. That's why you need Malchus, the Mekabel, to actually create existence. So let me explain before we read further. You may have learned this or maybe not, but regardless, in a number of places of Chassidus, and the first place that comes to mind is in Torah Eir. The Alter Rebbe, there's, even though Torah Eir, most of it was written by the Manichim, namely the Mariel, the Alter Rebbe's brother. And nevertheless, there are a few places, I think 2 places to be specific, where the Torah is printed that this is B'ksav Yad Kodesh Shel Radmunish Mesedim Ba'asmei. The Alter Rebbe actually wrote a few sections, small sections. There's one place, I think it's in Pasha Truma, where he says the following. And the context of an interface, talk about interface. So we know in general, a Seder Shtalshelus is an interface between the divine and existence. That's a general rule. But in the interface itself, we know there's so many levels. I mean, Atzilus is an interface, Bri is an interface, Chochm is an interface, Ak is an interface. They're all Memutzayim. But each one, like it is in any, think of a complex piece of engineering. How many interfaces are there from when you turn on a switch till the light gets turned on? So there's all kinds of switches that go on and off to make sure to regulate the flow. So there's interfaces all the time. Like think of a pipe structure. There's the main lines, there's the arteries, there's the smaller pipes, or in the human body, the same thing. So in that context, in Atzilus itself, what is the real mumutza? So he says that Atzilus consists of moichin, mides, or specifically Chabad, Chagas, and Nihim, and Malchus. So Chachma Bina Das is generally reserved for the Mashpia alone. That's why when you learn, you're not connecting to other people. We talked about this. Moichin is conducive to be alone when you're studying. Someone comes over and says they need something, it will disturb your solitary focus. Midas, on the other hand, is already hashpah. It transmits. But it's the transmission coming from the level of the mashpia. Malchus is the makabel that receives from Zah and is able to give birth and carry that energy into Biyah, creation. So what he says is like this, that Zah in microcosm is the bottom of Elam Ein Sof. Like he says, Seif Elam Ein Sof. That's the language he uses there. Madrega. So even though usually Ein Sof we talk about Lifnei Tzimtzum, before the Tzimtzum, or at least higher than Atzilus. Sometimes the worlds above Atzilus are called Elam Ein Sof. It's all relative. But in Atzilus itself, Atzilus, as we know, is an interface. On one hand, it's a divine emanation. It's an expression of godliness. Vayetzel min haruach, when it says about Moshe Rabbeinu, that he imparted from Moshe's spirit to the Skenim, so it has from Moshe, it has something from the higher source. So Zohar reflects what is called the Ein Sof element, the divine element, the divine infinite element of godliness. Obviously not quite like it is before the Tzimtzum, but in relative in Atzilus itself. And Malchus represents how it's going to be transmitted and reach into the Makablim, into the Nivroim. So that's why you say Zah is Zachar and Malchus is Nekeva. These are the two partners. One is like the Chassan and the Kala, and both are necessary. So what he's saying basically is this. Since Zah is fundamentally a Mashpia, so though it's already getting closer, Mashpia by definition means it's going to transmit to a recipient. But on its own, you don't yet have the Keli. You don't yet have Malchus. So even though it's true, it's not quite like the higher levels of Ein Sof, it's Achrena. It's considered like the lowest of the high. But like we said before, Oyer, even when it comes down to the lowest level, it's still Oyer. And that's why on its own, it would not, the existence could not be. That's why you need to have Esavas HaMetzias from B'chinas HaMalchus Dafke. But Dvar Hashem Shamayim Nasu. Dvar Hashem, God has to speak. Sometimes Zohar is compared to thought. Sometimes it's lower than thought. But bottom line is, Zohar is, if you want to talk from the emotional point of view, you have emotions. But those emotions can be too intense, and you need Malchus to channel it, to be the Keli, the Makabel, that allows the creation to take place. So therefore, it's really a combination of Zohar and Malchus, but Zohar on its own, he says, Loi hoye efshel liyas b'zeh metzias ha'elemis. And now he's going to bring it back to Zohar and Malchus as the sun and the moon. Shekenu gam k'moi shoye b'b'chinas shnei ha'me'eres ha'gdelim. And this is true, not just after the diminishment of Malchus, of the moon, that when they were still two great luminaries, Mavur b'makam acher shehoye meb'chinas ha'malchus he'isavas meb'chinas mitzias dover. So now let's again, I'll explain. Go slowly here because the lines are very dense. So he says like this. So you could say, you know what, that's the case after the diminishment of the moon. But when there were two Shnei Me'eres Hagdelim, Malchus too was a powerful luminary. So you could argue that Malchus, you can't have creation for Malchus either, because it also is very intense. In one thing, when Malchus is diminished, so we can't look at the light of the sun, but we can look at the light of the moon after it's diminished, because it's not quite as intense. But we're saying that this mashpia makabel concept is even before the Mir Talavana, like he said clearly in the previous page. So how do you explain that? How do you explain what is Malchus accomplishing that Zohar is not accomplishing? Malchus also is in full brightness. What makes Malchus able to channel the brightness of Zohar in a way that you can create existence? He's now going to explain what that means. A very fascinating piece here. So he says like this, that even when there was Shnei Meres Delim, Malchus does create something that Zohar doesn't, which is a Metzias Dover, something that exists. Why? Metzias, because that's what's, let's take away the word why. He'll explain in a moment why. Metzias Hoya Lakus. However, before the Miyat Alavona, before the diminishment, this Metzias would feel like it's Alakus, but it would be in existence. Zohar can't even create a Metzias, because it's oyer, and oyer is about gili. Malchus, even before there's the diminishment of Malchus, he says they'd create a mitzias, but the mitzias hoya lakus. Ubedugmas is going to give an example. For example, ubedugma, kamay neshama is the biyah she'ena lakus. Like the souls of Bria Tzir Asiya, they're not like the souls of Atzilus, but they're also called Elikus. They're also divine. And nevertheless, they're in a form of Yesh and Davar. They have substance. I know this needs explanation. I shall explain it. And he's going to, so I'll explain it. The Rebbe Rashab is going to explain it with a few examples. But let me see just a second whether I explain right now. Yeah. And the same can you say about regarding Malchus, even as it's a Moyer Agadol, a great luminary, and has not been diminished. Meir Gili Alikus, and there Malchus Meir Gili Alikus. The fact that Malchus through it shines and radiates Alikus, Makom Hadizem Makom Mokim, Ayadat Simsum Vehelim, Be'efin Sheyuchel is Kabel. It's still in a form of Simsum and Helam, a concealment and a diminishment and concealment, in a way that it can be received. And yet, it's still a lakus. So he's now explaining that Mashpia and Makabel can be understood, even in the world of Elikus and godliness, that there's two different, they have two different roles. So I'll explain this. I'll explain what this is. Let me give an example for it.
The parenthetical, is that Olam Hagashmi? Did you say that?
Moyer HaGadol.
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
Okay. It needs a little elaboration. Let me elaborate. I think I'll use an example from the Pasuk L'Osed Love. It says, it's a verse we've quoted quite a few times. It says, V'lo yelamed oid isha sre'eyu. The Mashiach comes, a person will not teach his friend. Ki kulam yedu eisi, because everyone will know eisi, will know me, meaning God himself. Lemiktanom v'ad gedelom, or lektanom, from young to old, or from small to large, from a cotton to a gadol. So the question is asked, you just said that one will not teach another, everyone will know God. So why is there a cotton and a gadol? What does that mean, cotton and gadol? Cotton and gadol, you could say, when we don't all know God, so we need a teacher to teach us. Moshe Rabbeinu receives from Hashem. He comes down from the mountain. He teaches Aaron, then he teaches his sons, the whole process of how Moshe taught. And slowly it trickles down and reaches every individual. But if everyone's straight from Kulam Yeda Asi, everyone's hearing it straight from God, to the point that you don't need a teacher, what's meaning of Katan and Gadol? It's actually a question that the Rebbe's father asks. The Rebbe also talks about in a number of places. And the answer is that even when Mashiach comes, it doesn't say the structure of existence is going to be eliminated. There will still be higher and lower. The difference will be is that the higher and lower will each have a direct link straight to the source. But it doesn't mean the structure will disappear. Because the Eibishter Creator say there's Tassus. He wants to have a structure. Like, for example, it says, Israel will spread out to all the land. The whole world will be like Israel. But Israel will be like Yerushalayim. And Yerushalayim will go even a higher level. So the point I'm making here is this, that there's two ways we can look at a teacher and a student. Let's use that example. It's a practical example. One is that the student simply is a child, a beginner, doesn't know, and that's that. And therefore he needs a teacher who will spoon feed and teach him first Ayin Beis, and then Ben Chamish Lemikra, Ben Asr Lemishnah, and he grows. Or even a scenario, even worse scenario, that due to ignorance, we live in a world where there's a lot of ignorance. We're born, even though everyone learns the entire Torah in their mother's womb, but we're made to forget, we're born in ignorance. We don't know anything until we're taught. So we're like living in Cheshech, and the teacher, the Mashpia, is illuminating us with Oyer, Teira, and we grow. That's Mashpia Makabel in a very practical level. But then there's another way to look at Mashpia Makabel, that even though we may know, and even if we're not ignorant, the fact of the matter is that the Eibishter wants things to be integrated internally in each level. So even if we're able to access the information, it has to come to our level. Not because we're ignorant or because we're lacking, but simply because you need the structure, like the Oyer of Chachma needs to go through a tzimtzum in order to get into the Oyer of, into Bina. Chachma goes into Chachma. So it's not because Bina is necessarily weaker or because Bina is missing, it's just a different entity. You can't give different entities the same Oyer. You need it to come down into a Keli. So what he's saying here is like this, that even if there was no diminishment of the moon, even the way God actually created the structure, and even if there was no Chet Eitz Hadas, and the Shemesh and the Levana would both be Shnei Me'eres Agdelim, even then the Levana still is a makabel, because the structure of existence is such that in order to internalize something, you need to have a makabel. And if you only have mashpia, you won't have the internalization necessary. So this isn't necessarily due to ignorance or due to a lack of, it's simply the necessity to be able to create something. Or to put it in different words, what Malchus does, he's saying here, is it creates a mitzias of yesh v'dava, their substance. If neshama stayed in Atzilus, you would never have an identity. Everything would be completely sublimated. Atzilus is completely elikus. But the Eibishter wanted a world. He wanted in this world, he wanted to bring godliness into this world. But in order to create an existence, you need a structure. And the mashpia itself cannot create structure. That's why you need Malchus, because Malchus creates mitzias davar. The only thing is, if there was no miyat halavana and it would be Moira Gadol, this mitzias itself would be a lakus. But it has to be a mitzias, or else we don't have a structure of existence. So the role of Malchus is to create structure. The role of Zah is to provide the godliness, the Ein Sof, the taste of godliness here, the transcendence, if you wish. So that's what he's saying here. We read it again. He says like this: Mibchina Zah, it has to be through Malchus Dafka. That's the truth, even when there were two great luminaries and there was no diminishment. Like we learned earlier, that even then, Zah and Malchus is Mashpia Makabel. Not Makabel due to weakness or due to lack, but Makabel due to structure. That's what he's saying here. So it has to pass through Zoh. We're talking again the creation process. We're not talking about after Aveda when Malchus elevates and so on, the creation process. So he says, so therefore, like the neshamas of Biyah, they're elikus, but they're elikus already in an identity. In Atzilus, you can't call them a Metzias Dover. In Biyah, you can call them Yesh V'Dover. Like we say, Yesh Misha Oyev. There's an identity that is bottled to elikus, but there's a Yesh, there's a Metzias. So Malchus's role in this sense is in order for it to be able to be a recipient, an entity that receives godliness, not godliness itself. Zoh represents the godliness that flows through it, the mashpia, the gilui. In order for there to be an existence, you need to have a recipient, and that's what Malchus does. Even as it's a moira gadol. And the Rebbe Rashab is going to give he doesn't need my approval, but it's an excellent example to explain this. He says, like it says elsewhere, so the Gemara says that it's a method of how to teach, that a person should always teach their students in brief. Don't over elaborate. In other words, sum it up encapsulate the idea, b'derech tzara. And he explains now why. Talmid hu kotten, because when the student is young, now kotten doesn't necessarily mean young in years, it could be young in yediyah, in knowledge. But regarding a kotten, hari behechlich lahaylim imenu, emek hasechel legamri. There's no choice but to conceal from him completely the depth of the idea. So that's for sure. But also a Talmud Gadol, even if the Talmud is a Gadol, is a great student, meaning an advanced student. The Gemara is not saying only a Talmud that's a Kotten. For a child, it makes sense. For a young student, okay, you have to give it to him in very brief because he doesn't have the patience or he doesn't have the bandwidth to be able to contain it all. But it says every student. Why? Because the kitzur allows another entity to receive properly. So it's not due necessarily to the weakness of the student. It's just due to the fact that there's another entity. As soon as there's another entity, there has to be an element of helam, or in the words as he's using, Malchus, in order for there to be receiving. Think of a relationship between two equals. We're not talking here a parent and a child or a teacher and a student. Let's talk about spouses, for example, siblings, friends. There too, you need kelim lekabel. It's not just you need a keli for someone that's less than you. Even if it's two equals, you see good communication, a good relationship is I recognize your space, you recognize my space. We don't just say, hey, we're both on the same equal level. I can just completely suffocate you with my energy, with my love, with my ideas. No, a separate entity needs kelim. So in other words, even if there was no tzimtzum, even if there's no miyat halavana, diminishment of the moon, and there was no flaw, the way the structure of existence is that a relationship requires a keli lekabbalah, not just hashpah. It requires recognizing the space of another, and commensurate to that, the communication and the relationship can be developed. That's what it means. It says, a person should always teach b'derech tzara. You could say, 1 second, it's an advanced student. He's a master student. He's almost on the level of the teacher. Why do you have to teach it to him in an encapsulated way? Because you have to recognize there's another, and you have to make sure that he's able to contain it. It's not just because he's young and inexperienced and doesn't have the knowledge. It's the recognition of another. That's the way I would explain this. V'zuhi ha'ashpah v'agili alakus sha'idei b'chinas malchus. This is essentially what Malchus does, the hashpah, the transmission and the divine revelation that comes through Malchus. Not just the gam kasha nimshach gile eir, that even when eir is nimshach, is being transmitted, that's what the keli, that's what the Kabbalah does, Makabal does, that it should be able to be received in Evraim. Take away Malchus, take away Kalin, you'd have, like, the sun would shine, the Zoh would shine, a powerful light, but there would never be the ability to contain it properly, if at all. And this is fundamental to the creation of existence. This isn't due to any sin or flaw or diminishment and so on. Why? Because Malchus is fundamentally a state of Helam. And here we're talking about Helam in a good way. We're not talking about Helam as in concealment of godliness, but rather Helam as in the allowing for another entity to emerge, which is the Makabel. That's how he explains Mashpia Makabel here. Be honest, I don't remember in other places in Chassidus such an elaboration in this context, even though the ideas are, you'll find them many places, but it's very interesting how the Rebbe Rashab is explaining Zoh and Malchus in a very interesting, unique way. Okay, so we're going to stop here, but let me stop if anybody wants to ask anything, any questions. Very interesting piece, yeah.
I have a question that's
Sure.
maybe a little more philosophical, and I know it's not here, but so you can say it's not here. I'm not going to comment. Too much processing. Wait, but I'll ask.
I
anyway.
see you know me like a book already.
Well, it's okay. It's good. He suggested
Very predictable, huh?
Yeah, that's all right. He seems to be saying that the neshama in Biyah, as it descends, has a quality of yeshus, of substance, of materiality, if you will, kiviyachol, as if it were.
I like to call it identity.
Okay, fine. That's an interesting phrase. I mean, maybe you just answered my question, but if you can say it has some degree of yeshus, like he says here, because it's been through Malchus and a number of levels of Malchus at that. So then if you look at it from the standpoint of the reverse process of the Helam ultimately giving the greatest Gilui, or even if you're looking at before the last level, before the days of Mashiach, in terms of hitting rock bottom, like we talked about before, and the sort of the Baal Tshuva bounces back from the lowest of lows by reaching deep into that Helam and essentially connecting with Elikus in that way. That essence of Elikus that's in the that's the Nakuda in the Rishimu Helam Atzmi. Anyways, the Inyan is, if it takes bittul to do that, and the neshama has this essence of yeshus in it, how can it ultimately have full bittul if it necessarily has a quality of yeshus in it? How can it have, ultimately complete bittul? Do you understand the question? Has to be mevatel on itself in order to draw down the lakus. But if it has a degree of yeshus, it fundamentally can't nullify itself completely because it has a quality of yeshus.
How do you define yeshus?
Well, it has substance. Literally it's materiality.
Why don't you ask the same question about much lower than the shamas of Biyah, the world of Tachtonim, which is definitely a world of ego, right, and even negative forces.
Well, I was talking
ultimately
about that.
Can be turned into becoming a home for God. Why don't you ask the same question? How could it be a home for God when it's a world that is, in the words of the Tanya, Mole Klippas v'Sitra Achra, it's filled with corruption and negative hostile forces to the divine, even forces that deny God, that say I and nothing else, total ego. Let's not talk about Biyah. Let's talk about this lowest of worlds. a world that we see around us.
Right.
Why don't you ask that question? Could that world like this become a home for the divine?
It's a good
How
question.
would you answer?
I would say it's a relative thing that there can be Elokus in the midst of Yeshus, but if you're talking about the ultimate revelation of Elokus, it seems there has to be a bittul of Yeshus.
So that's called avodah. That's called the avodah that we do. That just like if you remember earlier, we talked about that there's a level of bringing the ayin into the yesh, and then there's the avodah of transforming the yesh to ayin. When a person takes their ego, and instead of directing it towards self-interest, she say, "Moida ani lefanecha," I acknowledge to you that you've given me my soul. Instead of focusing what I need and what I want, that's called the work of a person, where they're sublimating, refining, channeling, elevating, bitter on etzutzis. Everything we learn what avodah is. Avodah means taking the yesh, even the lowest level of yesh. Here we're not even talking about the lowest. Here we're talking about yesh simply as an identity, an identity that has a certain independence. But even a full yesh, that's the avodah that we're asked to do every second of our lives, is to redirect, instead of living an egocentric life, to live a divine-centric life. And that transforms the yesh into a keli for ultimately reaching up to the highest levels of godliness, to the point that even the yesh itself, as we learned, can also be transformed, because the yesh was created by mitziusim atzmusei, misha ein lo ilu v'siba v'acheres shekodmelei, chas v'shalom, as he explains in the Geras HaKodesh 20. Maybe that if you recall that concept. But regardless, the point is that is the avodah. That's exactly the difference between avodah. So we begin first by creating an existence. There you need to have and keli, like he explains here. And then comes the avodah. As I said, that's a whole different track. That's when we begin to grow and develop and transform ourselves to become and go back, retrace the steps from the yesh back to the ayin and even higher.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay. As far as what he's speaking about here, he's saying that Atzilus, when Neshama in Atzilus, we say the Neshama is like inseparable from godliness. You can't talk about a separate entity. You could say it's Chesed, the Merkava. It's Chesed of Atzilus. It's Chesed of godliness. So it's a category of Chesed, not Gvura. When you're talking Biyah, you're talking now the Neshamas have become a separate entity, as not in the Yesh, as in the ego, or in self-interest, but rather as a yesh, as an independent identity. So chesed of bria is the mitzias of chesed is much more apparent, and then it recognizes, however, that it's chesed of godliness. It's like the difference between Rabbi Hillel, who would go to take a nap on Friday afternoon, and the Alter Rebbe who fell asleep Friday afternoon. One just happens naturally because he's so aligned. And Rabbi Hillel didn't happen naturally, but he still aligned himself willingly. That would be somewhat the difference. So one senses themselves as an independent identity, but yet that independent identity is completely aligned with God. Where in Atzilus, it's initially aligned. It doesn't need it doesn't even need that effort. Even though I'm sure there's also Avodah there, but it's not quite the same way. That's what he's saying here regarding before the Malchus of even Malchus before any type of diminishment. When you talk about after diminishment, and when you come down below, then we're dealing with yet another issue, the concealment that happens through chatoim, through sins, like after the chet tzadas, etc. Then you have to also reverse that. That's another additional element. But he's talking now here, even in the pure creation of existence, mashpia makabel. Now, why he's making this emphasis, we'll learn later. He's still going to talk more about mashpia makabel, and he's going to come back to the air of all these ideas. Remember, all this is coming to explain. If you remember, he began with Teirem Amayla Lamata Ma'ayin Liyesh on page 1350, and spoke about Ner Mitzvah, the Ner Mitzvah, Ner Neshama, and then from that he started speaking about Er Hariyah. So developing a whole concept here.
You froze. We can't hear you. Maybe someone telling you that it's time to end the class. We can't hear you.
That will. Oh.
I think you came back now. You still can't hear you.
Hear me?
Frust-
You can't hear me?
Now we can. It was frustrating. You were coming to a punchline. We lost 15 or 20 seconds.
Okay. So we'll stop here at the end of the paragraph on page 1356. And just keep in mind the flow that all this began with Torah on page 1350. After Tefillah, Amshacham Maya Lamata, talked about the ner of a neshama, the ner of a mitzvah, and then said to explain that, which is the flame transforming existence. Yeah. And then to explain that, he went into Eir Hariyah on page 1352. But all this will be unpacked properly as we learn further. You guys can hear me?
Yes.